This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you. I am John Allen, your host here on Last Week in the Church. This is the show, either video or podcast, depending on how you consume it, in which we rummage through the last week on the Vatican and the global Catholic Church beat, looking for those few items of towering, tremendous, and titanic importance that you need to know, and if we can't come up with them, their nearest facsimile. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with a cautious opening. The Vatican issues a new, what they called a little lexicon, a small vocabulary, dealing with end-of-life issues, which signals a more flexible, moderate, and dialogic stance on certain long-contested matters. We'll unpack what the Vatican said, who said it, and why it matters. Second, tough cases make hard law. We'll explain why on the particular issue of artificial nutrition and hydration for chronically ill patients, this new lexicon sort of modifies a previous stance the Vatican had taken in the middle of an intense political hurricane, illustrating why intense political hurricanes aren't always the best moments to craft law. Third up this week, we've got Jubilee juice. Just a heads up for those of you who may be considering coming next year for the great Jubilee of the year 2025. Rome may not have enough power to operate its grid while you're here. I'll have some survival tips for you. Fourth this week, the synergy of scandal. If you stick around long enough on the Vatican beat, every scandal, mystery story, and conspiracy theory ever floated intersects with every other one. And this week, we saw that playing out again. Explain which two stories, which two beams were crossed this week, and what to make of it all. And then, finally, this week, we're going to end with angling for Asia. After the summer holidays, Pope Francis gets his fall off with a bang with a 4-nation 9-day trip to Asia. We'll unpack where he's going and what to look for. All that and more is waiting for you on this episode of Last Week in the Church, so please do not go anywhere. Do not touch that dial. Don't get a snack. If you want to, you can turn up the air conditioning. That's the one thing I give you permission to do. Stay where you are, because I will be right back. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, August 13th. In the year of our Lord, 2024. This Thursday, on the Church's liturgical calendar, is, of course, the Feast of the Assumption, but most Italians know it better as the holiday of Ferragosto. This is a contraction of two Latin terms, Feriae Augustae, referring to holidays decreed by the Emperor Augustus back in the day, in the era of ancient Rome. Then, as now, the idea basically was to give Romans an excuse to beat the heat by getting out of town. And not much has changed over the last 3,000 years. Still today, around this time of year, any Roman who has the capacity will flee town either for the beach or for the mountains, or in the case of some ambitious Romani, they will do both. But in any event, they will get out of the sweltering, stifling, and suffocating August heat that perennially plagues the city. My wife and I are no exception. Shortly after we finish recording this video, we are taking off for our own small week-long vacation. So one programming note, that means there will be no episode of Last Week in the Church next week. So the next time we meet, it will be the last fortnight in the life of the Church. But that just means we'll have more to talk about. Speaking of stuff to talk about, let's dive in. So we begin this week with a cautious opening. So this week, the Vatican's Pontifical Academy for Life, which is headed by Italian Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, not Paglia, as you will sometimes hear in some Anglophone broadcasts. It's Paglia. In any event, this organism, this agency of the Vatican, which deals, roughly speaking, with life issues, put out what it called a piccolo lessico, a small lexicon that is a kind of little dictionary on issues, on terms relating to end-of-life issues. So we're talking about euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, palliative care, proportional care, issues such as artificial nutrition and hydration, living wills, advance directives, that whole cluster of issues around the end of life. For a long time, the most intense pro-life battles were fought around the beginning of life, right? Around abortion, embryonic stem cell research, and so on. But today, there were equally titanic clashes at the other end of the spectrum, around the end, and this lexicon is a reminder. In general, the significance of this lexicon, and let's be clear, the Pontifical Academy for Life does not in any direct sense have any teaching authority. It does not have the power to amend either Catholic doctrine or the Code of Canon Law. But nevertheless, it is looked to as sort of at least semi-authoritative in interpreting how the Vatican applies doctrine and law and how it will do so under this papacy. And the significance of this lexicon probably is that it marks a kind of cautious opening on at least three fraught issues. One is the issue of artificial nutrition and hydration and whether that can be withdrawn for chronically ill patients, particularly those who are in what is often called a persistent vegetative state, that is, who are comatose, not responsive to stimuli, unable to communicate their wishes, and where physicians believe there is no realistic possibility of recovery. Second would be the issue of what the Italians call un testamento biologico, a biological testament. In the Anglosphere, we would call this a living will or advance directives. And then the third is the issue of physician-assisted suicide, not so much in terms of whether the Church is ever going to approve that. The lexicon makes it clear that it never will, or at least has no intention of doing so now. But the more political question of whether there is space for compromise in a diverse, pluralistic culture where there are clashing, passionate opinions about these issues. So let's take them very briefly one by one. Back in 2007, the then Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a response to two dubia, that is, questions, formal questions, submitted to it by the bishops of the United States regarding artificial nutrition and hydration, the gist of which was that as long as a patient's body can still assimilate the food and the water, then that's not medical treatment, that is routine patient care, and it essentially cannot be legitimately withdrawn. The new lexicon, on the other hand, says that artificial nutrition and hydration, clinical experience has shown, is, or at least can be, actually a form of medical treatment, and there's greater space on a case-by-case basis for determining whether the continuing provision of artificial nutrition and hydration, particularly through a feeding tube, remains proportionate to the overall well-being of the person who is under care. So, number one, a more moderate, flexible, case-by-case stance on nutrition and hydration. Second, when it comes to the living will, in many ways, this battle is already over. I mean, in the United States, advance directives have been around for quite a while. Here in Italy, they were legalized by an act of parliament in 2018. However, what is significant about this is the Vatican is now officially openly recognizing that a testamento biologico, that is a set of advance directives, is a legitimate instrument for a patient to communicate their wishes regarding end-of-life matters in advance. This, too, represents something of a departure from what had been the kind of no-fly zone stance the Vatican took in the early 2000s under then Cardinal Camillo Ruili, who was head of the Italian Bishops' Conference and the Pope's vicar for Rome. Titanic battles were fought to try to block the adoption of the Testamento Biologico, the advance directives here in Italy, and Romania basically won most of those fights back in the day. The argument was that it would mark a slippery slope towards euthanasia, and also he raised issues of informed consent. Just because somebody signs a document 10 years ago, how do we know that still represents their will today? That was the argument. And on that basis, the Vatican and the Italian bishops took a hard no. That hard no has now become something more like a soft yes. Okay, that's the significance of this development. And then finally, when it comes to both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, The new lexicon makes it absolutely clear that church teaching is not changing. Catholic doctrine continues to be opposed to both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide on the basis of the inherent dignity of each person and the idea of the respect for human life. But what the document does say is that there has to be space for what it calls points of mediation between different positions in a diverse political environment. I mean, in other words, what it's basically saying is that Catholic doctrine is one thing, but how that doctrine gets translated into civil law in an environment in which the church's voice and the church's perspective is not the only one that matters, that there is space for negotiation and potentially compromise around those issues. That has enormous significance here in Italy. It's been seen as giving Catholic politicians here permission to enter into negotiations, because what happened is that in Italy, the Constitutional Court in 2019 decriminalized physician-assisted suicide in certain limited cases, but it never specified the conditions under which those cases could be said to have been met. They were thinking Parliament would adopt a law, but since 2019, Parliament never has, in part because Catholic politicians of both left and right have been reluctant to move forward. This lexicon, therefore, is seen as giving them permission to try to fill that legislative void. So, basically speaking, this is of a piece with the overall thrust of the Francis papacy, moving from what had been non-negotiable absolutes on many pro-life matters to more softer, kinder, gentler, more flexible and dialogical positions. You will either see that as great pastoral wisdom or surrender to a culture of death, but whatever you want to make of it, that appears to be the clear trajectory. Now, second and related is just a footnote to all of this, which I'm calling tough cases make bad law. I mentioned those dubia back in 2007, which were issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in response to questions that had been submitted in July 2005 by the Committee on Doctrine of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. Now, those questions came straight out of the Terry Schiavo controversy in the United States. And I know there's been a lot of water under the bridge since, but if you can remember those days in the early 2000s, particularly when it crested in 2004, 2005, the debate over the fate of Terry Schiavo was one of the most intense cultural affronts, and it even became a political football in the 2004 presidential election, because then Governor Jeb Bush in Florida was a protagonist, and his brother, then President George W. Bush, took up the issue, actually tried to ram through emergency action in Congress. Basically, the deal with this, Terry Schiavo was a woman who had fallen into an irreversible coma in the 1990s. Various therapies had been attempted without success. Her husband eventually decided that he wanted to withdraw artificial nutrition and hydration to allow her to meet what he regarded as her natural end. Her parents, however, argued that Terry was a devout Roman Catholic who would not have wanted to defy church teaching and end-of-life issues. They launched what became a protracted legal battle, and as I say, this got sucked into the sausage grinder of the culture wars in the United States and became one of the most anguished political cases of 2004, 2005, and particularly the more aggressive, muscular, pro-life movements in the Catholic world adopted saving Terry as a kind of signature cause. It's noteworthy, for instance, that now ex-father, Frank Pavone, recently laicized, but still president of Priests for Life. At the time, of course, he was still wearing a Roman collar, and he was the priest who preached the homily at Terry Schiavo's funeral mass. Again, an anguished, heartbreaking, enormously thorny, and deeply polarized political debate. That was the consequence in which the American bishops posed these questions to the Vatican. And here is another interesting twist. Do you know who the chair of the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Doctrine was in July 2005? It was Cardinal William Leveda of San Francisco. Do you know what job he held by September 2007 when the Vatican issued its responses? He had become the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which means that Cardinal Leveda actually answered his own questions on behalf, of course, of then Pope Benedict XVI. In other words, American fingerprints were all over this thing. And I think what it demonstrates is that the hothouse atmosphere of a deeply polarizing and agonizing political debate oftentimes can be the wrong moment to draw sweeping long-term moral and policy conclusions, perhaps with the passage of a little bit of time and the fact that there is no analogous political hurricane unfolding right now. Perhaps that means that this lexicon was able to take a more balanced and less pressurized view of things. All right, moving on. We come to Jubilee juice. You may recall last week, I apologized for the fact that there had been no last week in the church the week before because our power went out here in Rome. Now, at the time, I was phrasing this largely as a personal frustration that for a couple of days, for one whole day, basically, we were without power, and then it kept going in and out on the second day before the thing kind of stabilized. At the time, I was willing to chalk this up to, hey, it's the summer, this kind of thing happens. But what has become clear in the meantime is that this wasn't simply a kind of personal frustration for us, but rather an endemic situation that has been going on in Rome for the last 3 years. I did some research. I found that periodic rolling blackouts in various parts of the city have been a chronic feature of Roman life during the summers since the year 2022, that the problem is growing, that just in July and August of this year alone, there have been at least 18 Roman neighborhoods that have experienced blackouts of at least 6 hours, in some cases entire days. The city is full of stories like this. Recently, in the Pareoli neighborhood of Rome, power went out for 3 days. And people who owned shops on the affected streets actually had to sleep in their shops at night because with no electricity, they couldn't lower the shutters to lock up the store. So if they had gone home, they would have been looted. There are restaurants that have reported having to throw out thousands of dollars worth of food because they were unable to power their refrigeration units, and on and on. Recently, the main distributor, the electricity distributor here in Rome, an outfit called Reti, had to acknowledge that the Roman grid is sufficiently antiquated that its maximum capacity in any given day is about 2,000 megawatts. For an urban area of 3 million, typically the output should be in the 2,500 to 3,000 megawatt range. In other words, half again what Rome is currently capable of. And that's the situation now, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about a city where, particularly during the peak months of the summer, June, July, and August, wide swaths of the city are periodically without power. And that's just with the 3 million people who are currently living in Rome, plus the normal tourist load. Think about what it's going to be like next year when an estimated 35 million additional visitors wash through this city as part of the Great Jubilee. Many of them, of course, will be coming during the summer. Now, look, I know that pilgrimage is not supposed to be, theoretically, a pampered experience, right? I mean, part of the allure of pilgrimage is the hardship of it. You're supposed to put some blood, toil, tears, and sweat into the whole thing. But on the other hand, think about elderly pilgrims who may be coming, or families with small children, or people with medical conditions. I mean, there are lots of folks for whom imposing hardships they didn't choose as part of the Jubilee experience isn't quite fair. So my advice to you is, if you're going to come to Rome for the Jubilee, and by all means come. I was here for the Jubilee of 2000. It was unforgettable experience. There's a magic to it, both spiritually but also culturally. An excitement in the air. So by all means, come. If you're worried about making sure you have electricity when you're here, I would avoid the summer, if at all possible. If you are coming during the summer, I would invest in a generator and a solar panel. We've got 3, and I'm frankly not sure that's going to be enough. Okay, that's where we are. All right. Fourth up this week, the synergy of scandal. As I mentioned at the top of the show, one of the things I've noticed over the years is that if you hang around long enough, every separate scandal or mystery or conspiracy theory or whatever about the Vatican eventually in one way, shape, or form overlaps with all the rest. Like, how the Vatican Bank scandals in the 70s overlapped with the assassination attempt against John Paul II and the various conspiracy theories about what was behind that, or more recently, how the London property scam that resulted in the trial of the century overlapped with these rumors that there were shady operators in the Vatican trying to send money to Australia to fund false sex abuse charges against Cardinal George Pell. You know, again, you hang around long enough, these things become like concentric circles. And we had a reminder of that point this week with the latest development in the Vatican Girl case. This is the 1983 disappearance of a 15-year-old girl named Emanuela Orlandi, whose father was a minor official in the prefecture of the papal household and whose family lived in an apartment on Vatican grounds right near the barracks of the Swiss Guards. Her disappearance became kind of the mother of all Vatican conspiracy theories. This week, her brother Pietro, who has dedicated his life to the search for the truth about his missing sister, released audio files of a couple of phone calls that his family had received shortly after Emanuela's disappearance. She disappeared on June 22nd, 1983. These were phone calls that came in to the Orlandi home the evening of June 25th from people, two males, by the sound of their voices, young males, who were purporting to have information about Emanuela and, in some sense, I suppose, trying to open some kind of dialogue with the family. Whether they actually knew anything or were doing this as a prank or were put up to it by someone else remains unclear. But in any event, we had previously seen references to these phone calls. This is the first time the Orlandi family has actually released the audio tapes of them. This was an occasion for the Italian press to remind us, however, that those phone calls on June 25th were not the first phone calls made to somebody purporting to have information about the disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. That initial phone call came the evening of June 22nd, the evening she disappeared. Somebody, again, a male voice, called the Vatican's central operator and said he wanted to speak to Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, who at the time was the Vatican Secretary of State, saying he had information about about a girl who was missing, who was connected to the Vatican. Now, at the time, Casaroli was with Pope John Paul II on a trip to Poland, so he wasn't able to take the phone call. The operator first sent the phone call to the Sala Stampa, that is the press office of the Vatican. Eventually, the call ended up being taken by a then junior Italian Monsignor who was working the overnight desk in the Secretary of State that night. Care to guess what his name was? Now Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, the now excommunicated Archbishop Vigano, who was, of course, public enemy number one of the Francis papacy. He was the one who took the call that night. He revealed this, actually, in a 2019 interview, so this is not fresh news. But it's been back in the news this week because of the release of these audio files. Also, the fact that the Italian Parliament recently launched an investigation of Orlandi's disappearance. Some people have floated the possibility that Vigano might be called as a witness to testify about this phone call he took on the evening of June 22nd, which raises the tantalizing possibility that Carlo Maria Vigano could be back in Rome and afforded a public stage, not in the Vatican, but by the Italian Parliament, to talk not simply about the Orlandi case, perhaps, but, well, who knows what else he might have on his mind. You know, how substantive all that will prove to be, one never knows, but if it happens, it ought to be great theater. And finally, this week, angling for Asia. So after the Ferragosto break, the first big-ticket item on Pope Francis's agenda for the fall will be a four-nation swing through Asia, September 2nd through the 13th, at least. Do I have those dates correct? Had to check with my superstar Vaticanista wife, who was also doubling as the camera person for this episode. Yes, September 2nd to the 13th are the correct dates. And the Pope will be visiting Indonesia, East Timor, Papua New Guinea, and finally Singapore before he returns to Rome. And just very quickly, let me give you one talking point, one thing to look for on each of these four nations as we prepare. for what ought to be one of the most interesting papal outings in recent memory. Indonesia probably is the big ticket item here. It's the star attraction because Indonesia is, of course, the largest Muslim nation in the world. And it is a reminder that although we in the West tend to think about Islam through the prism of Arabic culture, Arabs represent only 25% of the global Islamic population. Put another way, 3/4 of the Muslims in the world are not Arabs. And so therefore, thinking that Islam equals Arab is as mistaken today as thinking Christian equals the West, because let's remember, 2/3 of the Christians in the world today live outside the historical boundaries of Western civilization, a share that will be 3/4 by mid-century. So you've got a kind of newfangled Islam and a newfangled Christianity. Pope Francis is trying to carve out a relationship with this increasingly diverse and far-flung Islam. His days in Indonesia will be obviously an opportunity to move the ball on that objective. In East Timor, you have the only majority Catholic country the Pope will be visiting, one of the few majority Catholic countries in all of Asia, a country that only recently gained its independence. Of course, its stability has been up and down since that moment came. But in general, people on the ground there will say that aside from the political highs and lows, there is a kind of rough coexistence between the Christian majority and the Muslim and other religious minorities of East Timor that could theoretically be a kind of role model for the region, something Pope Francis no doubt will be wanting to extol, as he also encourages East Timor to kind of step out of the cocoon it has been in because of its internal difficulties and assume more of a role on the broader Asian stage as one of the few majority Catholic countries in the region. Now, Papua New Guinea, this is a trip all about the peripheries. Francis is, of course, a pope of the peripheries. Papua New Guinea has always been regarded as kind of far-flung mission territory for the Catholic Church. And while the Pope is there, he's not only going to be visiting the capital city of Port Moresby, but he's going to be visiting the most isolated diocese, the most peripheral, if you like, diocese in this incredibly peripheral country, obviously symbolizing his view that, in the end, size doesn't matter. That the importance of preaching the gospel is not dependent upon the size of the population. Also, as part of this, of course, it's another opportunity for the Pope to lift up his celebration of indigenous cultures, because there will be indigenous persons that he will be meeting with along the way. And as a footnote, no matter how peripheral this isolated spot in Papua New Guinea may be, it turns out there are also Argentinians there. There is a group of Argentinian sisters, Argentinian clergy. So the Pope is also going to be having, a kind of, tango-infused Argentine hootenanny with his homies. Whether empanadas will be consumed or whatever, these details have not been disclosed, but we will have our eyes on the situation. One final footnote about Papua New Guinea: among the various outfits in the church that have long had a missionary presence there, my bros, my homeboys, in the Capuchin Franciscans, when I was in high school, I used to get told by my religion teacher to get on my knees and pray for the Capuchin missions in Papua New Guinea. Those prayers are now coming home to roost. Finally, Singapore, one of the most developed economies in Asia, obviously. It's another small state that has had its struggles to overcome a reputation as something of a financial pariah, tried to clean up its act, and done so quite successfully. It has been a collaborator with the Vatican, among other things, on its own project of financial reform, and that has sort of fueled a kind of budding partnership between two small states that see one another as kindred spirits. This trip is an opportunity for Francis to deepen and extend that friendship. Elise will be on the papal plane. She will have this thing covered like saran wrap, so be following the Crux site for her setup, her on-the-ground reporting, and her after-the-fact making sense of it all. That is our show for this week. Remember, no show next week. We'll be back here in a fortnight. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed Feast of the Assumption, a fantastic and blessed Ferragosto. Stay safe, stay healthy, above all, stay cool, and we will talk to you again very soon.